Okay, so we're going to finish up chapter 31, and if I remember correctly, um, well, let's just run through it, I guess, real quick. So we started off with Nixon, right? Nixon came into the presidency um, after Kennedy was assassinated and LBJ became president. Nixon was up next. And remember, he utilized what he termed the silent majority, right? And he said, if I can get the silent majority to vote for me, I'm going to be president. And that's exactly what happened. And so he came into a situation, of course, the United States was neck deep in Vietnam at that time. And he did manage to get the United States out of Vietnam, but it certainly wasn't without controversy, right? He expanded the war by, I don't want to say invading, but definitely by involving neighboring countries, Cambodia and Laos. We did say that he was reelected with a pretty easy reelection campaign, but it was his second term that Nixon really ran into problems. He had problems with the economy, but most notably, right, Watergate. That was the scandal that brought Nixon down, and it wasn't necessarily the crime itself, although that was certainly bad. Remember, it was the break-in of the Democratic National Committee headquarters. They were going to put in like electronic listening devices. They were going to bug the offices. They were looking for, the Democratic strategy on how they were going to get their members reelected. And I don't know that Nixon knew about the initial break-in. I don't know that he was like planning it from the beginning. But he certainly knew about it after the fact. And the cover up is what got Nixon in trouble, right? He had these conversations in the Oval Office talking about how they were going to cover this break in up. And of course, there was the recording system that recorded these conversations. And when that came to light, that's what got Nixon out of the White House. Ford became president. He had his own issues with the economy. He pardoned Nixon right off the bat. That certainly didn't look good. And then Carter came along as president, and remember his big claim to fame was he was an outsider, right? He wasn't mixed up in Vietnam. He wasn't mixed up in Watergate. He was governor of Georgia, so he had, political experience. He had executive experience, but he wasn't mixed up in Washington politics. But the problem with that is that he didn't know anything about Washington politics. He didn't know how the Washington machine worked. He didn't know how to get his agenda passed. And so Carter is going to run into a lot of problems. So you see, there's a series of presidents, right, that all struggle with the presidency. You have Nixon, who resigns in disgrace. You have Ford, who struggles after him. You have Carter, another one-term president after him. And by the end of Carter's administration, you can definitely tell that the people are kind of worn down. The people are kind of tired of politics as usual. And you can kind of see that there's a change coming on the horizon. And I think the last thing I finished up with on the video was the rise of the right. We spoke about the rise of the Christian coalition, evangelical Christianity, and then the rise of neoconservatism, which leads into the election of 1980. And I didn't cover that in the video, right? This is new stuff. Yes, yes. Okay, we'll say yes. All right. You guys did watch the video, right? The election of 1980. So we have Carter, who's running for re-election, but again, he's deeply unpopular. And he's running against Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan had been a force in Republican politics for some time now. He had served as governor of California. And of course, California is a huge state. I think today, if you took California by itself, it would have one of the top 10 economies in the world, not counting as part of the United States. Just California itself has a top 10 economy in the world. So he's coming in as a major force in Republican politics. And he campaigns on this new kind of neoconservative platform. He comes in talking about returning powers back to state and local governments. He comes in talking about morality, the Christian right. He comes in talking about, traditional conservative values. And he wins. He wins in a landslide. He wins, I don't know, the popular vote is very close, but the electoral college vote is like entirely lopsided. Reagan wins overwhelmingly. And he comes in and he promises a very ambitious program. He basically says he doesn't actually call it this, but he kind of labels it as like a New Deal for conservatism. Remember when Franklin Roosevelt came into the presidency during the Great Depression, he talks about the New Deal, and we get, things like Social Security. Reagan comes in and he's talking about the most changes since the New Deal, but it's going to swing in the other direction, right? He's going to swing back towards the right. All right, so let's talk about Reagan as president. A couple of things I want you to know about Reagan. He's very, very good at delegating authority. In fact, he earned the nickname the Teflon President. What's Teflon? Anybody know? It's a type of material you usually see associated with like cookware. And what's the purpose of Teflon on cookware? It's non-stick, and that's exactly what they meant when they called him the Teflon President. Nothing stuck to him, because anytime a scandal happened, and we'll talk about some, he had some issues that he had to deal with. Anytime a scandal happened, he could say, well, that's not my fault. I put so-and-so in charge of that. Something went wrong. Well, that's his fault. Oh, that went wrong. That was her fault. I'm delegating authority, right? I'm handing authority out to my subordinates, and I'm putting them in charge. He was not very involved in the day-to-day running of the government, and I think that's a pretty big contrast. I think Jimmy Carter was. I think Carter wanted to be in on every meeting. I think Carter wanted to be kept up to date with all the major stuff, and he wanted his hands. He wanted to be active in everything. Reagan is he steps back. He's the chief executive in charge, but he's willing to delegate his authority, and that, like I say, that does work out in his favor, because he's able to take a step back and kind of dodge any criticism that comes his way. He comes in and he promises to free America from what he calls the special interests. And remember, special interest groups in the United States had really kind of taken off since the New Deal. Previous to the New Deal, the two big, you had the government who talked to big business, and that was it. By the time we hit the 1980s, interest groups were very, very influential, and they still are today, of course. But he managed to make conservatism seem progressive, and that's really kind of that's a neat trick to do, because the idea of conservatism at its core is keeping things the same. That's what it means to be a conservative. You want to keep things the same, and yet so here's Reagan, who's promoting conservatism, but he's doing so in a way that makes it seem progressive, which is, like I say, politically speaking, that's a pretty neat trick to be able to pull off. All right, so let's talk about Reaganomics. His brand of economic theory, he didn't come up with it, but he is so good at popularizing it that it becomes synonymous with him. And like I say, if you listen to the news these days, sometimes you will hear people refer to as Reaganomics, and that's what this is. So Reagan loved to talk about freedom, all kinds of freedom. And we'll get into the Soviet Union here in just a little bit. But one of the things he liked to talk about was economic freedom. And in fact, he had a kind of a little slogan. He wanted you to earn your keep and keep what you earn. Earn your keep and keep what you earn. So he wanted Americans to work, but he also wanted them to keep more of their paycheck. A traditional Republican platform is cutting taxes, and Reagan is no different. He didn't come up with this. This has been a Republican thing for years and years and years and years. But here's what he does. He is going to reverse the trend of a progressive tax rate. Remember, we started talking about a progressive tax rate back when we were talking about the early 1900s, right? Progressivism and populism. So this is what he argued, and this is what usually people mean when they talk about Reaganomics. He wants to cut taxes on the wealthy. Now remember, a progressive tax system, the more money you earn, the more money you're taxed, right? So if you make, let's say, $30,000, maybe you pay 5% of your income in taxes. But if you make $300,000, maybe you pay 10% of your income in taxes. That's a progressive tax rate. The more you earn, the more you pay in taxes. Reagan comes in and says, no, we should be cutting taxes on the wealthy. This is known as supply side economics. He says, if we cut taxes on the wealthy, what are they going to do with that money? You know, let's say that you're a millionaire and one year you paid, and I'm just making up numbers here, one year you paid $100,000 in taxes, and the next year you only paid $50,000 in taxes. You've got an extra $50,000 to play around with. What are you going to do with that money? Are you going to let it sit in your bank account and just sit there? No. You're probably going to invest it. And by investing it, you start a new business, or maybe you invest in an existing business and that business gets larger and they hire more workers. Maybe you start a new business and they hire more workers. It's called trickle-down economics. You start at the top, you cut tax rates at the top, and the benefits are supposed to trickle down through the rest of the economy. More people get more jobs, more people are working, that puts more money in the economy's doing better, and then those people are paying taxes too, right? And so even though you cut taxes on the wealthy, even though you're paying half the taxes of what you used to, maybe the overall tax base increases, right? Because more people are working, more people are paying taxes, and it all evens out. That's the idea behind supply side economics. Sometimes it's called trickle down economics. Sometimes it's called Reaganomics. You cut taxes at the top, they invest that extra money in the economy, more people go to work, which equals more jobs, more money, and more taxes. Okay. Now, he does not get along with labor, which is actually kind of funny because at one point in his life, he was actually the head of a labor union. Before he became governor of California, what was Reagan's main claim to fame? Anybody know? What was his regular job before he got into politics? Yeah, he was a movie star. And he actually had served as president of the Screen Actors Guild, which at its core is a labor union. But by the time he got into politics, I actually think that Reagan identified as a Democrat earlier in life. I don't think it was until he actually got actively involved in politics that he switched over to the Republican Party. But anyway, he is not a fan of labor. And there is a pretty severe crackdown on labor during his presidency. Labor unions begin to shed members. In fact, I think by the time his presidency ended, I think only 11% of American workers belong to a union, and that's the lowest it had been easily since the Great Depression. Now he does face some struggles in the economy. In 1982, right at the beginning of his presidency, there is going to be a pretty severe contraction of the economy. It doesn't last that long, but it's very, very harsh. It's very deep. Now, like I say, less than a year later, the economy has bounced back. And for the remainder of the 1980s, the economy was very good. But there at the beginning, he did suffer an initial setback. Now, one of the issues with the economy of the 1980s was inequality. There are lots and lots of money being made, but it's very unequal. Some people are getting really, really rich, and some people are getting more poor. And in fact, the middle class in the United States is going to contract a bit. Some people have referred to this as the second Gilded Age. Remember way back when we were talking about the 1880s, right? the Gilded Age. If something is gilded, it looks really pretty on the outside, but once you kind of begin to chip away at that, you realize that the core is maybe rotten or substandard or something like that. Yeah, if you look at all the charts and graphs, all the numbers are going up, all the bars, all the lines are going up on the graphs, everything looks great. But once you begin to chip away at it, nah, maybe it doesn't look so good. Um, for example, the S&L crisis. Again, as part of a sort of traditional Republican platform, Ronald Reagan pushed for deregulation. So he wanted less government red tape. And of course, the argument behind that is the less rules and regulations on companies, they can operate more efficiently, they can generate more profit for their shareholders. Deregulation is good for the economy. The problem he ran into, a savings and loan is kind of like a bank. It's not exactly the same thing as a bank. They don't really exist much anymore. But that once they were very popular, and they did operate kind of like a bank. Well, what happened in the 1980s, the entire S&L industry imploded on itself. It just collapsed. It was almost like the old bank runs of the Great Depression. They're all going bankrupt, and there is a national agency that was designed to step in, like FDIC, right? If your bank goes under, the government has protected you, and you'll get your money back. There was a national agency that was designed to protect S&Ls, but it went bankrupt. It's bad, and again, it's not. It doesn't look great on Reagan. One of the reasons that the economy was booming the way it was is because the United States had huge deficit budgets, and of course, a deficit budget is where you spend more money than you take in, right? So if you, as the United States government, say, I plan to bring in $100 billion in taxes, but I've budgeted $200 billion in spending, that means you have a deficit of $100 billion, right? And then that money is added to the national debt. Well, Reagan went on a spending spree. A big chunk of this was defense spending, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But Reagan tripled the national debt, and people got so scared of this that Congress actually proposed a constitutional amendment that would have required a balanced budget. Now, this doesn't happen, and if it had happened, it probably would have been devastating to the economy. But yeah, Reagan comes in as a fiscal conservative, right? That's a traditional Republican platform. Democrats were kind of painted as they tax a lot and they spend a lot, and Republicans were kind of the opposite of that. We're going to cut taxes, but that's okay because we're not going to spend as much. Well, like I said, Reagan comes in and goes on a spending spree, but he does remain incredibly popular. And when he runs for re-election in 1984, he wins even more strongly than he did in 1980. In fact, in 1984, he won every state except for one. He was running against, I think Mondale, Walter Mondale was the Democratic nominee in 84, and he was from Minnesota, and he carried his home state. But every other state other than that one went for Reagan. It was probably the biggest. One of FDR's elections might have been bigger, but it was easily in the top two landslides in American history. Reagan was incredibly popular. Now, he is going to be disappointing to some Republican conservatives, though. And again, this is kind of the same thing that Nixon ran into. The cornerstones of the New Deal and the Great Society, things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, these programs are here to stay. Now, Reagan does cut some spending on social programs, and that was one of the things he campaigned on. He does cut spending in things like welfare programs and food stamps and things of that nature, but he doesn't touch the big programs. He doesn't really advance his moral agenda. In the 1980s, abortion was still legalized. It had become legal in the 1970s with Roe v. Wade. Still legal in the 1980s. Divorce rates were rising in the 1980s. He doesn't do a lot to, like I say, to advance his moral agenda. I have up here, he made strides on drug use. That's kind of, kind of. Because on the one hand, he does uh, shine a spotlight on drug use in the United States. This is where, Just Say No campaigns come from. This is where Red Ribbon Weeks come from. But on the other hand, drug use in the 1980s, it was not going down. It was going up. All right. Drug use intensified in the 1980s. He does make strides, and part of his agenda, such as prayer in schools. There are several high-profile court cases that confirm the right of prayer in schools. But on the flip side of that, he's also going to cut back on civil rights and affirmative action. Okay, that was Reagan domestically. On the international stage, his foreign policy, he is focused on one thing, and that's the Soviet Union. Reagan feels it was part of the neoconservative platform. Neocons wanted to focus on the Soviet Union. And remember, again, this is a flip-flop from Carter. Carter came in and said, it's all about human rights, right? Well, Reagan is going to do another 180 and say, no, it's all about the Cold War. And in fact, I believe it's in his first State of the Union address, he comes in and he calls the Soviet Union an evil empire. We've got to do something about the evil empire. And Reagan, and again, this is part of that deficit spending, Reagan begins the biggest military buildup certainly in American peacetime, but maybe just in all of American, no, probably not bigger than World War II, but still, a huge military buildup. Now, he had a plan, and we'll talk about it here in just a few minutes, but he had a plan behind this military buildup. Part of it was, we want to be able to fight and win a war if it comes to that. Absolutely, that was part of it. Part of it was, we have to keep up with the Soviets. He began what was popularly known as the Star Wars Project. The actual name of it was the Strategic Defense Initiative. Basically, he had the idea of space weaponry. Let's put giant lasers in space, so if the Soviets launch missiles against us, we can shoot them out of the sky. Now, it doesn't work, as we find out hundreds of millions of dollars later, but that's the kind of spending that Reagan is going to engage in. Now, this scares a lot of people in the United States, the so-called Vietnam syndrome. We don't want to get involved in another Vietnam. Absolutely not. And everybody's looking at this military buildup. You build tanks and planes and guns and bombs, and somebody's going to want to use them, right? That's the fear. We're building up this huge military, and people know that we're not just going to sit around and admire it. We're not going to just sit around and look at it. Somebody's going to want to put this thing to use. And are we gearing up to get involved in another overseas conflict like we got involved in Vietnam? And nobody wants to see that happen again. And so he's making a lot of people really nervous with this military buildup. Well, he comes out with his own doctrine, the Reagan doctrine. And he says, we will oppose communism anywhere. Now, that's not a big, dramatic departure, right? We've said that for the past 40 years at this point. We will oppose communism anywhere, regardless if the Soviet Union is involved or not. Because remember, of course, the Soviet Union, while that's the big one, it's not the only one. We have communist China, there's communist Vietnam, there's North Korea, there's Cuba. And in fact, the United States will get very, very involved in Central and South America. A great example of this is Grenada. There was a pro-Cuban government, a socialist government of Grenada, and Reagan sends in troops to get rid of that government. Now, that's really kind of a anomaly. He doesn't send troops all over the world. He is much more likely to send guns or money or some other type of aid rather than sending in American troops. But he was not afraid. He was not afraid to do so. And like I said, we get very involved in Central and South America, Chile, El Salvador, Guatemala. And these countries are headed up by some not great people. And again, remember, this is one of the criticisms of the Cold War, is that the United States is so focused on defeating the Soviet Union that we don't care about anything else. There's one question. Are you for the Soviet Union or are you against the Soviet Union? And if you're against the Soviet Union, that's enough for the United States. That's enough for Reagan. We don't care about your human civil rights record. We don't care about how you treat your people. If you're against the Soviet Union, that's enough for us. Now, you do need to know about probably the biggest foreign policy scandal in Reagan's administration, and probably the biggest scandal of his administration, period, and that is the Iran-Contra scandal. And again, it has to do with South America, has to do with Nicaragua. Nicaragua was being controlled by a group known as the Sandinistas. Nicaragua was being controlled by a group known as the Sandinistas. And we don't like the Sandinistas because they don't like the United States. And they had gotten rid of a government that was very pro-United States. So Nicaragua was a friend of the United States. Then the Sandinistas come along. They oust that government. And now Nicaragua is anti-United States. Well, that was bad enough. But Reagan's administration and Reagan himself, they wanted to fund the Contras. The Contras were a group in Nicaragua that were fighting against the Sandinistas. We don't like the Sandinistas. They don't like the Sandinistas. Let's give them money. Let's give them guns, and maybe they'll get rid of the Sandinistas for us. Congress came back and said, no, can't do it. You are not allowed to aid the Contras in Nicaragua. The Reagan administration said, all right, well, this is what we're going to do. Secretly, we are going to sell guns to Iran. Now, this in and of itself was illegal. Iran was under an arms embargo. You're not allowed to sell guns to Iran. So this was all done, below the table. We're going to sell guns to Iran. And the money we get from that, which doesn't exist on any of the books, right? This is not an official sale. This is all done in the shadows. This money doesn't exist. We're going to use that money to fund the Contras. And we're talking about like literal, you fly to Iran, you get a suitcase full of cash, and then you fly that to Nicaragua. That's the kind of stuff we're engaged in here. So we're illegally selling guns to Iran and then using that money to illegally fund the Contras in Nicaragua. And of course, it eventually comes out. They eventually find out that this happened. It's a huge scandal, right? After remember everything that happened during Vietnam, the My Lai massacre, the Pentagon Papers. After all these government scandals of Vietnam, Iran-Contra is like we're right back there, right? Now, here's the thing. Reagan, the Teflon president, nobody really knows for sure what his involvement was. He's never actually accused of any wrongdoing. And he always says, it was that guy, it was that guy, it was these underlings that did this. So he's never actually accused of any wrongdoing, but it goes very high into his administration. A lot of people lost their jobs because of the Iran-Contra scandal. Okay. All right, so here we are with the Soviet Union. Now, what Reagan was trying to do with the Soviet Union, he was trying to spin them out of existence. Because here's the thing, right? We're engaged in an arms race. If we build a tank, they've got to build 2 tanks. If they build 2 nuclear missiles, we have to build 3 nuclear missiles, right? We're engaged in an arms race. And the thing is, Reagan was willing to bet that our economy could handle that. He didn't think the Soviets could. And as it turns out, he was right. So as we get deeper into the 1980s, the Soviet Union is in really bad shape. Nobody knew it at the time, but it was getting in really bad shape. And eventually, they will get a new leader by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev, he's kind of put in the same position as almost FDR was. Remember, I said I don't really consider FDR a radical, right? Because FDR came into power in the United States at kind of a turning point. And FDR realized that unless there was small change, moderate change, there was going to be big change. There was going to be a revolution. I think Gorbachev was in that exact same position. He came into the Soviet Union. He realized things are really bad. And unless he pushed for moderate change, there was going to be big change. The difference is FDR was successful in the small change. Gorbachev is not. So Gorbachev comes in and he starts talking about these 2 things. And I want you to know what they are. Glasnost is Russian for openness. Glasnost means openness. He says we're not going to do things in secret anymore. Remember the Iron Curtain, right? No information got in, no information got out. We didn't know what was going on. Gorbachev says, no, we're going to be more transparent. We're going to let people know what we're doing. We're going to be more open about it. Glasnost, openness. And he also spoke about perestroika. Perestroika is Russian for restructure or reform. He says we're going to change, we're going to be more open about how we do things, and we're going to change how we do things. And Gorbachev says, Reagan, please, you're spinning us into bankruptcy. You got to take your foot off the gas. And Reagan said, okay. He says, I understand. You're trying to make change, and I'm going to help you out. Now, it's not enough. But by the time we hit the late 1980s, the Soviet Union is in kind of a death spiral, and there's nothing they can really do about that. But relations were better during the late 1980s. And it's not going to happen during Reagan's administration. It won't be until George H.W. Bush. But the Soviet Union is going to collapse far sooner than anyone expected. By the time 1989, 1990 hits, that's it. They didn't realize it at the time, but they are in the final days of the Soviet Union. So the legacy on Ronald Reagan, it's kind of a mixed bag. At the beginning of his administration, there was a really, really bad recession. There was an S&L crisis. There are problems with labor. That's on the bad side. But on the good side, the 1980s were go, go, go. The 1980s, all about making money, right? And it was. The economy was booming. Now, a lot of people got really rich and a lot of people got more poor. It was unequal, but on the whole, there was a lot of money being made. Domestically, again, he was unable to do to follow through on a lot of his promises regarding the big social spending programs, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, those types of things. Foreign policy, he did oversee the fall of the Soviet Union, even though it wouldn't happen until he was really out of the presidency. And he exited office with a great reputation. Even things like the Iran-Contra scandal did not really stain his reputation. And in fact, of course, his vice president, he was still popular enough that his vice president, George H.W. Bush, would run for the presidency in 1988 and kind of ride his coattails into the presidency. Um, but, like I say, it's a bit of a mixed bag. All right. And that is the last note you'll ever have to take in U.S. history, too. Congratulations. So, study guide is up on Blackboard. Be sure to study hard. Remember, 150 points. That's a big chunk of points for this course. Don't just blow it off. Extra credit. I'll give it to the end of the day if you need to email it in, but it's got to be today. And otherwise, I will see you guys in 1 week. Right, in 1 week. Thursday, May the 5th, for the final exam in this room at 9:30. If you have any questions between now and then, be sure to email me.